Hello and welcome to Tonight at 8 from the RSGB. Most radioamateurs suffer from various kinds of man-made interference, nowadays most often from VDSL internet or cheap everyday electronics around the home. But from the mid-1970s there was another form of strong and distinctive QRM which could be heard on many of the HF bands and which seemed to emanate from Russia. Well, there have been many theories over the years, but Keith Snyder, KI6BDR, has been busy reverse engineering the facts to try and uncover the truth before time erases history. And we're delighted to welcome him now from his home in California. Hello, Keith. Can you give us a quick update and taster of your talk?
Yes, hi, thank you. I work on antennas all the time. I started in 1980. And when I was on the web, I came across a picture of the Duga 3 antenna in Russia and saw some videos and decided to try and reverse engineer this antenna. It's so huge, it's 15 football fields in size. So I was intrigued by that and just could not stop investigating. And then I decided to make a talk for ham radio clubs, and it's turned out to be a fascinating talk for people who experienced this thing called the woodpecker back in the 1980s.
Well, it sounds fantastic and we're really looking forward to it, Keith. But before Keith's presentation, a reminder to you at home that if you're watching this on Monday the 7th of February, then this is live and you can ask questions and make comments on either BATC or YouTube at any time during the presentation or straight afterwards. Please include your first name and your call sign if you have one within every message. And note that you can make this video stream fill your screen on most devices, usually by double-clicking on the picture or pressing the full screen button. But now, let's go back to Keith to find out more about the Russian woodpecker.
Right. I have here a little CD called The Russian Woodpecker. It's a movie, and it's an amazing movie that I found that describes the antenna as perhaps a top secret weapon and perhaps tied to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explosion. And I found a lot of good information about the politics behind the nuclear power plant and if there is a connection between the Russian woodpecker. So what I'm going to do is I studied antennas at Ohio State University. This is the John Krause antenna Bible, and because I have all of this information under belt and have computer programs, I thought I'd go ahead and show you my presentation on reverse engineering of the Russian woodpecker antenna. So I'll switch over to the other screen here. Okay, so what I have here is the trailer for the movie that I mentioned, and I'll go ahead and play the trailer first before the presentation.
The noise is called the woodpecker because it makes a pecking noise.
Reversing. Very good.
The noise is called the woodpecker because it makes a pecking noise.
Аварии на Чернобыльской атомной электростанции в городе Припяти.
Могла ли быть связь русского дятла и авария на Чернобыле такая? Я хочу узнать. И кто в этом виноват?
Кто-то на них надавил и взрываются.
Полковник говорит тебе, Леру, говорит, такая проблема. Ну, такая проблема, что убить могут. Сейчас я не для камеры. Я боюсь. Советская система зла, как ты заметил, ведут в Москву.
Чернобыльской катастрофы нет. Это был придуманный.
В этой трагедии должны быть свои причины. И случайностей не бывает.
Okay. Now let's go to the presentation. I hope you can hear me okay. The presentation starts now. And this is a picture of the Russian woodpecker. And it is, like I say, 15 football fields in size. Before I start, I'll just give a couple of thank yous. One is to my wife, and this is my cat. This is the house where I have my ham radio antenna in these palm trees. This is my old job at Northrop Grumman working on drones, and my new job at Northrop Grumman working on a space station that circles the moon. And this is Marilyn Monroe, who used to also work on drones. So I just thought I'd warm you up with that and start with the fact that we're going to investigate the Russian woodpecker, the largest antenna ever in the world. And the signal was actually broadcast all over the world. We will review the size and analyze the antenna patterns using a computer code called FICO. And we'll try to dig into the history of the arrays and look and see what kind of secrets we can find out. It started broadcasting July 4th in 1976 and was on the air for 13 years. And this antenna had many names. Besides the Duga 3, it was called this Steel Yard, and it could have been Duga 1 and a couple other names for it that were classified. So here we go. I'll go ahead and start with the sound of the woodpecker. So hold your ears, here it comes. We're looking up at the antenna from the ground, and you can see some of the feed elements here. That sound is irritating. It irritated everybody. All over the world, it irritated everybody. So the first thing we can do to start analyzing the antenna is go by the frequencies that were on this spectrum. And those frequencies were captured and listed here. So at the lower frequency, we have somewhere around 8.3 megahertz. And at the higher frequency, we're around 16.5 megahertz. And you can find out what dipole lengths those would be by using the simple formula. Dipole length is 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz. So the length of a dipole at 8.23 megahertz would be around 56.8 feet. And of course, somebody would try to get your frequency from you. It used to be classified, but it's now been recorded, so we know what the frequencies are. And the purpose of this array is to give early warning to the Russians by detecting American missile launches. And if they could detect them at their launch, it gave the Russians 25 minutes to prepare a response. This is the Google Earth view of the arrays. There's actually two antennas here. The low frequency is the big one, and the higher frequency is a little bit smaller. So this would be the 8 megahertz, and this would be the 16 megahertz antennas. Metal construction just had, for the low frequency antenna, was 150 meters in length and 500, it was high 150 50 meters high and the length was 500 meters. So it's 492 feet by 1640 feet. And that's almost a third of a mile, 1640 feet. The high frequency is a little bit smaller. It's only 100 meters high and it's 250 meters wide. Construction, it was 14,000 tons, and that's why it's called the steel yard. And it began construction in 1972 and was finished by July 4th, 1976. So it took them 4 years to build. And it made a tapping sound that was heard on all the ham bands, basically HF bands around 8 and 16 megahertz. And it was on the air for 13 years. So we'll look at this. This is a beautiful picture of the larger array. And you can see that there are large white dipoles, many of them spread across the front of the array. There's a lot of sand at the bottom of this array, which I believe was ported in to help with the reflections and make a consistent dielectric constant so that they could broadcast and get a good launch of their wave. So this is how large the antenna is. These green rectangles are the size of one American football field, which is 300 feet by 160 feet. So if you look at putting 15 of these football fields on the face of an antenna, that's just incredible. It's just that's why I could not stop from analyzing this antenna. I was too intrigued not to. Here's a view from the top of the antenna looking down at a car, and it's just like the size of an ant. And I went ahead and modeled the antenna in FICO, the computer code. And then I also modeled the Giza pyramid and placed it next to it. And you can see that the antenna is quite large compared to the Giza pyramid. The Giza pyramid's 481 feet high. And here's a view from behind the antenna, and it looks like we have a lot of pine trees. It's in beautiful country, and they tried to hide this antenna top secret. There was bunkers out there with airplanes ready to fly, and you were not allowed to talk about this antenna if you lived in the Ukraine. So on the movie, of the Russian woodpecker, there were people saying the antenna did not point at the United States. And I decided to go ahead and check that fact out. So I used Google Maps and placed the array, looked at the array from above, and I measured the angle from true north. And it turns out to be, if you use a compass and you go around clockwise, to be 325 degrees around the compass. So if I plot 325 degrees on a map from Kiev, you can see this is Kiev, is the UKKK. This is an airport. I was able to predict first the angles to Miami and then the angle to San Francisco and bound the problem. And then putting the 325 degrees of the orientation of that surface of the antenna points right down the middle of the United States. So number one, the movie stated it didn't point to the United States, and number two, it does. And what were they pointing at? This is what they were pointing at, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force. This is the plot of the bases that were in the United States in 1988. So you can see they were trying to cover the launches from these intercontinental ballistic missiles. And throughout this presentation, I'm just going to pick and choose photographs that I could find on the web. A lot of people took pictures, they were sort of sneaking onto the grounds. And this photograph shows a map of the globe. And you can see it's a polar map. So they were denying also that it was pointing at the United States, but why would you need a polar globe if you're not going over and across from the Ukraine to the United States. So that's another indication that they were doing over the horizon radar. And here we go with a picture of the spectrum. You can see there's like 4 different frequencies being used. And when we look at the different locations where they had these arrays, they were going to cover the entire globe with over the horizon radar and detect any intercontinental ballistic missile launches. So a friend of mine, Steve Stearns, put together a few lists of superlatives. Is it the biggest? No. Arecibo is the largest in Puerto Rico in terms of a reflector antenna. Is it the tallest? It's not exactly the tallest. There's a radio station in Cincinnati that was 831 feet tall. Is it the most powerful? Well, it's 10 megawatts EIRP, but the HARP array in Alaska is 3.7 megawatts total radiated power. Is the most expensive? It could be. It was 7 billion rubles, and in today's money, that would be $600 million. And that was right at the verge of being twice the price of the nuclear power plant that was right next door. And is it the heaviest? Probably is. It's about 13,000 pounds to 23,000, excuse me, 1,300 to 2,300 tons. And it's about 3.5 times the weight of the Eiffel Tower. And Steve says it's the prettiest. So that's his take on that. Here's a map that shows where the Chernobyl reactor is, and then the Duga arrays nestled here in the trees. There's a large reactor pond here, excuse me, cooling pond for the reactor. And you can see we're about 5 miles away from the reactor and about 6 miles away from the town of Chernobyl. In the movie, they said Duga 3 is only a receive array. This is one of the kernels that was showed in the movie. And of course, he was saying that there was the transmission was coming from this town up here, which is Lübeck. And the answer is Lübeck only has about 2,000 people, according to Wikipedia, and would be a perfect spot for a receive antenna rather than a transmit antenna. And then if you're in a city and it's populated like Chernobyl, if you're broadcasting, you don't have any problems getting through from the RF standpoint. So it really makes sense that Duga 3 was the transmitter and the site in Lübeck was a receiver. And this area here with the radioactive sign is a radiological reserve. It's like a forest that's no longer available to people because of the radiation levels are too high. So the purpose of the antenna was being described as, let's make sure that the USSR has time to react to the launches of any intercontinental ballistic missiles from the United States. And we know that we're pretty sure that this person, Vladimir Musets, in the movie was lying because it doesn't make sense that this was true, that the Duga was a receiver. And the reason why we know that is because some of the radio clubs triangulated the signal and it went right to Chernobyl. So the Vladimir Musets, the commander, was just lying on the air, basically, in the movie. So if it was transmitting, could it have bad effects, possibly miscarriages for pregnant women? Could some of the people in the buildings be getting too much electromagnetic radiation? And if you need that much power, was it tied to the Chernobyl plant? I think it is. And it needs to be RF quiet. So that's why that receive antenna was probably in the small town. And the high power can just, be used in a highly populated area. So So we believe that most of the information that we've been able to pull up is leading towards the transmitter in Chernobyl. And the other code name, the secret code name, was 5H32. It repeats every 10 seconds. So the ticking was 10 ticks per second, and the bandwidth was 40 kilohertz. The people who did the triangulation, it was printed in the Institute, the Wireless Institute from Australia. So that's where we get that information. So the triangulation pointed right to the Duga 3, and it's just basically a huge broadcast power emanating around the world. This is the, I'm going to go quickly through this. This is where they're building a shield over the burned out nuclear reactor so they can contain radiation. The shield is now finished, and you can see it from above. And it was producing 3,200 megawatts. And it had 4 RBMK 1000 reactors. I'm not going to buy one on Amazon. And each one of those was 1,000 megawatts. And so it was said that the Duga consumed about 1/4 of the power when it was broadcasting. So that would be approximately 1 megawatt to power not just the antenna, but all of the computers that were custom built for this processing that had to go on for the signals in order to find where our ICBMs were launched from. Here's a little bit more the overhead. You can see the cooling pond and then the cooling towers. And you can see the arrays. The large array has 15 columns and the smaller array has 10 columns. And we'll do the analysis of the antennas. First of all, let's get a perspective. These are tourists looking at the array, and this is just one element. This is one dipole. Look how large that is compared to the people. Here's somebody who's rather brave. I wouldn't do this, but you can see he's on the antenna, and the power plant is in the horizon right there. So if you want to go on this tour and go down this path, please go ahead. I'm not going to. It's too dangerous. And here's another photograph of the some of the scaffolding and support gantry for this. So looking at the antenna, there was a lot of photographs from the tourists, and I was able to get some that showed a screen that's behind the antennas, the dipoles, and some feed lines. And we'll go ahead and look at these closely. Each set of antennas, there were 2 columns. So one would be over, say, here on the left, and then another one would be overlapping, and then another one would be on the right. And they were using that to conserve space. And the feed boxes looked much more hefty. So instead of being a receive antenna, this sure looks like it was a transmit antenna with good insulators. This is a picture of the feed of the dipole, and it has twin leads. And then each set of these dipoles was suspended by another set of insulated supports to hold them up and keep the spacing exactly where they wanted the spacing to be. The impedance, according to Steve Stearns, after looking at these pictures, was approximately 275 ohms for the twin leads. And if you look at these dipoles, you can see they're one above the other, and they're supporting each other and fed with the twin leads. And you need to have an insulator in order to not ground your circuit. So these are made out of insulated material, and probably rather unique at the time that this was built. We have a plus and a minus, and then we have insulators between the supports. And we have from a Russian book, this is how to build one of these antenna dipoles, which is called a cage dipole. And you can see the insulators and how they used to support the original patent antenna. And then some more Russian words on the patent. MAKC is maximum. So you can see 0.05 wavelengths maximum as the cage width. And then the length is 0.33 wavelengths maximum. And this is insulation or shielding of coax feeder. So the insulator was holding the cage, and then you would feed at the center. So we were able to go ahead and take this image and digitize it and put it into AutoCAD and predict the difference between, say, a single dipole without the just a single wire dipole. You can see the frequency response of the reflection coefficient. And then for the cage dipole, you see a much deeper response, which means it's working better at 5 megahertz. This might show a little bit lower frequency than it's operating at. And so it could be that I overestimated the length of the dipole, but I was able to go ahead and take the antennas and model them in FICO and get the array pattern. And that, with the element pattern, will give us the total antenna pattern. The VSWR goes down from 5 megahertz to 40 megahertz. So it's fairly broad banded. This dimension B is, according to Steve Stearns, the optimum dimension for placing a reflector behind a dipole. And in this particular case, at 8.26 megahertz, that distance would be 21.43 feet. And you can see this is a really good picture showing the screen reflecting the energy from the dipoles. This is the FICO model of the same cage dipole. And this is the antenna pattern. It's a prediction of the antenna pattern. If you look down the axis of the dipole for just the wire antenna, that's shown in blue. And that's just a circular antenna pattern. But when you put that reflector there, the pattern goes away from the reflector towards the opposite side and has, in this case, 7 dBi gain versus 2.6 dBi for the dipole, the wire dipole. So you get an additional 4.6 dBi gain by reflecting the signals off of that wire screen. And this is a frequency response of the cage dipole. This is the gain on away from the antenna, and it's always higher with the cage behind it versus frequency. So this is the gain versus frequency, and the gain is always higher with the reflector. We're probably looking around 8 megahertz for the operation of this. So this is a movie of just a single dipole radiating, and you can see how the waves go out, and it's rather beautiful. It looks like a nice lava lamp from the 60s. And then if we add the reflector, you can see that the energy is now directed. This is the reflector here. So we do get a really good response and directivity from the wire screen behind those dipoles. Now, if we go behind the antenna, somebody got a really good photograph, and I overlaid some lines over these feed lines. So you've got red positive, black negative. And if you look, this is the dipole below. The red's on one side, it's on the left side. And then when you go back, it's got to be the same phase as connected here to the one above, and it's reversed. So it's now on the right side. And so if length A is a quarter wavelength, and the line, in other words, the lines are twisted, then the feed above will be in phase. And so we'll go ahead and check that out and see if that's true. I went ahead and digitized the photograph. You can see I put little lines on top of the white dipoles and the tower structure. And I was able to use the length from left to right being 500 meters and get the dimensions of the antenna spacings, and created the array in FICO with the screen behind it. And you can see that they're alternating The antennas are alternating between rows. And the distance again here is 21.4 feet behind the dipoles. Also, I'm including a ground plane, by the way, and I'm putting in the dielectric constant for sandy soil when I do the calculation for the antenna patterns. So quickly, the dipole length, about 82 feet, could be a little bit smaller than that. It would shift the frequency. But the spacing that we get from one antenna below to the antenna above is about 20.8 feet. And let's call that dimension C, and then we can do some mathematics. So here's two dipoles, the lower one and the upper one. The dimension here is C, is 20.8 feet. That comes directly from the AutoCAD drawing. And then we have the 0.18 wavelengths for dimension B. So we have B and C, you just take B squared plus C squared square root, and you should be able to find A. That turns out to be 29.9 feet. And at this frequency, which is 8.26 megahertz, if we take A and we divide it by the wavelength, we got 0.251 wavelengths. And that is a bingo, that's a match. In other words, A is a quarter wavelength. And it appears that the antenna below is being fed in phase with the antenna above. And so we have 15 elements across, 20 elements tall. We have a lot of sand down below, so the sandy soil, I used an epsilon relative of 2.55 and a loss tangent of 0.0062 for the dielectric constant of the soil. And this is what the antenna pattern looks like in 3 dimensions. When you look at the towers here, the antenna is going horizontally. You will see the antenna beam is quite pronounced, has very good gain. And one thing that I wasn't expecting, and one thing that maybe the world was not expecting, is that it has a tremendous backlobe. Very, very strong backlobe. That's really not good, because it was radiating towards Saudi Arabia in this case. So let's go ahead and look a little bit more. Here's the antenna pattern on a polar plot. The peak gain is about 29.4 dBi. That's here. And then it's coming up at an elevation of about 6 degrees from the horizon. So it's up about 6 degrees. And then that's going to go into the air and bounce off the ionosphere and go to the United States. Backlobe is not much different. It's 23 dB versus the 29. So you're really spreading this energy all over front and back. Here's an antenna pattern from above. You can see it in azimuth. Lots of side lobes. And if you put it into dB from 30 to minus 30, they are definitely going in quite a large azimuth as well as front and back. This is the antenna pattern again. And if I import that onto the map, this is the way the antenna pattern looks in its location in Chernobyl. And now it's going off to the left and backwards to the right. That has a lot of excess energy all over the earth. Let's just look at what if you're living here and you're working here. This is the near fields that are created if you have 10 megawatts of power and you're at a sample plane of about 5 feet from the ground. That's quite a lot of field intensity on the ground. And so I look at it from the front and from the top and see that this energy is going near the array. And then these buildings are shown on the map right behind the array. You can see them here. I'll highlight them with red lines. And now you can see all of these buildings are pretty close to a very high near field radiation pattern. So they could be in danger in terms of electric fields being too strong. And here's a plot again. There's a road that's there and then these buildings. So these buildings that are in the green regions are questionable. The limit is 22 dB volts per meter. That was given to me from Scott Burnside. And so we're definitely pushing the limit here. So the limited being 22 dB volts per meter. And you know that the antenna is going to bounce off of the ionosphere. So I thought maybe they steered the beam up. So why don't I steer the beam with some phasing, and I'll calculate the phase for that. All I have to do is take the angle that I want, which is 30 degrees up, and I come up with a phase of 31.45 degrees electrical phasing in order to make the plane wave go up 30 degrees. That would be the progressive phase shift between each antenna in a line. So I was able to steer the beam up, and this is not in dB, this is just linear, but you can see it's rather colorful and beautiful, steered up just fine at the right angle of 30 degrees at 8.26 megahertz. And the gain again in dB has a peak at 30 degrees of 26 dBi. I still got a very big back lobe. Here's the side lobes looking from the side. And again, maybe there's not much difference in the near fields, but it is lower, so it might be safe in this case here. So I'll just go ahead and skip through this, go quickly through, put it back on the map. And now we can see from Kiev or from Chernobyl, we're going to go over the top of Greenland in order to go to the United States. And we're also going to upset a lot of people in Saudi Arabia with their radio interference. So it looks like there's probably 2.5 bounces, I'm thinking, between the ionosphere and the United States in order for them to intercept the ballistic missiles launch. And then I'll go quickly through the smaller array just to show it was analyzed. Dipoles are 72.2 feet, and we'll just go through this quickly. We don't need to look at all the geometry, but we predict another antenna pattern at about 4 degrees elevation and 31 dBi gain. This is the overhead view in azimuth. You can see there's lots of side lobes. And we put it on the map. And we segue to, let's think about the next topic. In other words, the explosion that happened at the end of the transmissions. So this is the last plot for the smaller array. And then I'm talking about the April 26th Chernobyl accident. That's where the antenna array was actually preserved because of this accident. So we have all of the structure still there because they couldn't go in and tear it down. So it's still standing, and you can still see these buildings, how close they were to the antennas. And who knows if there was a problem with radiation? Who knows if they're trying to cover up people getting ill and blame it on the power plant? We don't know a lot of things because it's on the web, everything seems to be misinformation. They called the road leading to the array a Boy Scout camp. Basically, they say, here's a children's camp, and they're doing everything you need to do to try and cover up the purpose of that antenna. And people were threatened to go to jail if you even talk about it. So when that power plant blew up, there were a lot of people, according to this movie that I was showing you the trailer to, somebody wanted to cover up the fact that the antenna wasn't working. working correctly, perhaps. That's what they were saying. And so in order to cover it up, there was going to be an inspection by the military about a month or two past that date of the Chernobyl accident. So when you spend 7 billion rubles and your antenna doesn't work, the person who invented it and was proposing it was perhaps trying to cover. He was in the movie, he was identified as one of the top politicians in Moscow. So they did order the testing to be done at the Chernobyl power plant. According to Dr. Fedor Dubrovka, he said the Duga technology was all unique. It was made of semi-precious metals. The devices, the receivers and the transmitters were all new. The transmitters were 2 stories tall and so very, very powerful. And he's talking megawatts. I believe 10 megawatts is the accepted value. And they needed special computers. So they were using handmade computers just for these CPUs to calculate the antenna, the launch directions. And they weren't cheap, so they were very expensive. And there were cables and amplifiers and phase shifters, so they may have been steering the beam up and down. So basically, he said it's nothing to sneeze at the cost of the antenna. So if you want to, you can go ahead and look up this movie. It's called The Russian Woodpecker, and I picked up that movie and watched it. It was interesting from a radio amateur standpoint. So I would recommend it if you'd like to find out more about the political situation. You may pick that up and watch it. Obviously, there's a lot of news about the Ukraine even today. So who knows if somebody wasn't afraid to do the bad deed of blowing up the power plant. So let me see if there's, oh yeah, so the part that didn't work, and in the movie, they mentioned that they were going to go to 4 megahertz because people were complaining about the other frequencies. And when they tried to go to 4 megahertz, it didn't work because the ionosphere was not cooperating, basically. It was actually blocking the signals. And there's different types of interference caused by nature, and it's called the aurora roar, and some medium frequency bursts, and auroral hiss. And these would have been interfering with the 4 megahertz or 5 megahertz signals that they were going to go to. So the aurora roar is around 2.8 to 3 megahertz, and the harmonic roar is 4.0 to 4.5 megahertz, and the MF is around 3 megahertz. So the Duga 3, we were expecting it to move to around 4.5 megahertz, and it was blocked by this aurora. So according to the propaganda out there, it wasn't working. So frequency 1 was 16 megahertz, frequency 2 was 8, and it would make sense for frequency 3 to be 4 megahertz. And it just wasn't working. You couldn't hear it. This is a plot versus time of day of the aurora, and it tells you what the frequency is on the left-hand side. So as time goes by from the beginning of the day through 24 hours for several days, 5 days is the green traces, you can see that these frequencies are all being interfered with between 4 and 6 megahertz. And this is what the aurora looks like in 3 dimensions and color-coded versus density. And it's like an apple, the top of an apple core. It's blocking the signal going from Russia to the United States. And so here's a plot. This is a little more up to speed. Shows the F layers that we as ham radio operators use in order to bounce our HF to different locations around the world. And down here is the aurora, somewhere near the E layer. And here's a display of, well, this is a picture of the display that was inside the remains of the power plant. And you can see on the wall, there's a map of this Earth and then the ionosphere. So I blow up that map, and you can see there's two layers that they're using that are indicated on this map. And you can see the upper layer, and it looks like they're even showing where the reflection occurs. I'm not sure if that's what these lines are, but they were definitely using the antenna for over the horizon radar. I don't know if these are missiles or not, but it looks like it. So according to the web, again, they say it didn't work. It didn't make sense. The project did not make sense. It was not able to fulfill the objective that it had been built. This may be true or false too, as well, depending on whose side you're trying to take. And so we did know that the Soviets used whatever frequency they wanted to and didn't care about any respect to any rules of the road for propagation. They went from 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz at will. I did look at what if they did use the face of the large antenna for 4 megahertz, and I found they could fit in a 102-foot dipole, and it could operate around 4.6 megahertz. And you can see there seems to be some insulators here, and I fitted in right in this region here. So this would be one side, and then there'd be another side. And you can sort of see the insulators over on this region here from this photograph. So they were experimenting in the 4 megahertz region. And there's the right side. And so I calculated the antenna pattern at the 4.6 megahertz. And you can see it's got a fairly strong antenna, a gain of 23.7 dBi, and again, the big backload. And that was with 15 elements across, 10 elements high, 150 elements. So there's the antenna pattern from the side. You can see the elevation is about 10 degrees, and the gain is about 24 dBi. And from above, it's a little spread out. And the overlay of the 3 different frequencies now. So you could choose which frequency you wanted. You could change a different launch angle from the different elevations. We're at 4 megahertz, we have 23 dBi gain, 8 megahertz, 29, and 16 megahertz, we're at 31 dBi. And you can see the beams change lift angle as you go lower in frequency. So the highlights are, it's a big array. It was 8 megahertz, and they had another one that could be 4.6 megahertz. They were experimenting there. And the small array is about 16 megahertz, and they had sandy soil for the dielectric constant. And they needed that power plant for not only the power, but reliability. During a nuclear war, you would want to have a reliable power source. And they broadcast around 10 megawatts of peak power. The transmitters were 2 stories tall, and it is pretty much clear that the antenna patterns were steered right at the United States, and the demise of the Chernobyl is what preserved the antenna. And so we're pretty sure that the antenna was working. According to the movie, they detected the launches of all of the shuttles during that period of time. That could be propaganda as well, because that was from one of the generals from the Ukraine. So you can go ahead and watch the movie if you'd like. It's an interesting movie, and I think that there's so much disinformation that you don't know what to believe on the web. But I think by looking at those antenna patterns and using geometry, we have some pretty factual predicted antenna patterns. And the photographs of the maps show that it sure wasn't over the horizon radar. And so let's see if there's anything else. Yeah, I have thank yous for Steve Stearns, Scott Burnside, David Palmer, and John Krause. So that's about it. That's my the talk right now.
Well,
go ahead and go back to live.
Thank you very much, Keith. We'll let you get in front of your camera, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of people asking questions and making comments. There's a lot to think about and I'm sure we're going to have people asking you things. So if you have a question or a comment for Keith, this is the time to answer them, either on the YouTube chat or the BATC messaging. And don't forget to include your first name and your call sign if you've got one. And if you've enjoyed this presentation, don't forget to give us a like as well. That helps other people see this video when it goes up on the RSGB website in the next couple of days. So let's start with a question that, well, it's actually a comment from the early days, and I'm sure there's lots of you who've been watching this who remember it. And one comment I spotted was MM7WAB, that's Paul, who says, always a haunting sound, brings back memories of many a late night shortwave listening back in the day. So I'm sure lots of others of you feel that way. I've got just one question. Can I ask you, Keith, just for clarification, when you showed us the picture of the map, of the plan of the Earth where it showed the propagation and things, you mentioned it was in the power plant. Did you mean the power plant for the transmitter of these antennae, or was that in Chernobyl?
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine, I think, yeah. Oh no, now we can't. I don't know what you did just then, but I know you swapped computers, so we might better...
All right, I'm back.
That's fine, yeah, we can hear you fine. So I don't know, maybe you couldn't hear the question. I was just asking that when you showed that picture.
The answer, I'm not quite sure what the question was about, but the
well, you said there was
map,
the map that was on the wall.
Power
yeah.
plant and
you mentioned it was in the power plant. I just wanted
orientation of the array was the direction towards Greenland and.
I was just asking. Can you hear me? Okay,
towards the United States.
Can you hear me?
I'm not sure if I have the audio still back here. So
I'm not sure you can hear me, Keith. Actually, Keith, can you hear me? I'm not sure you can. I think you may have muted your sound from us. So that's going to be very difficult to get questions to you.
Well,
can you hear me now, Keith? Keith, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Keith? I can see you on a monitor I've got in the corner of the room, but I think you've turned off the audio from us. Can you hear me now? Keith?
I keep getting the feedback.
Are you getting the echo? Okay, so maybe Tammy, we might be able to, I've got Tammy M0TC who does all the controlling and stuff here next to me, and she's going to try and switch off one of the microphones. I think we've got some feedback there because you've used 2 computers for tonight. So we're going to try and asking you now to unmute one of those microphones, Keith. So I suggest the microphone and the computer that you're looking at, if you could unmute that, we can only allow it to be unmuted, but you have to physically do it. So if you could do that. I'm sorry, everybody, but please don't let this stop you asking questions, because I'm certain that we'll get communications back between us. So please put your questions on YouTube chat or BATC, and we'll be back with you. Keith has still not unmuted his mic. I can just see it from a control here. Yeah, the bottom right hand corner, Keith, if you can hear me. It's in the bottom right hand corner of your screen. So your bottom left. Okay, sorry, it's your bottom left, Keith. You should find an unmute
that
button.
kind of makes a difference.
Now we've got you. We've got you. Can you hear me?
I'm the southpaw, and the answer is yes.
Brilliant. We've got there. All right.
Okay.
So I'm sorry. The question I had for you just to start, and I'm sure we'll have other questions shortly for you as well, is when you showed us a picture, quite a stark picture of a big map on the wall of a power station, or power plant, I think you called it, and it showed the propagation and it showed antennas and propagation layers. Was that the power plant? Was that the power plant for the actual transmitters for this, or was it in Chernobyl?
Yeah, it was at the antenna site. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Just for clarification, we've got you back now as well, and we can see you and hear you, so everything's fine. So let's ask you a couple of questions, pass on a few questions for you. Andy McGee, I don't have your call sign, Andy. This has reminded me of something from 30 years back. Does anyone know what the blank carrier was that was continuously transmitted on 26.975 in the UK? That may not be associated with this, but it was the first question I saw. I don't know if that's 27 megs, I guess, so it's just under 27 megs, so that might be something to do with citizen band, possibly. I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
I'm not exactly sure of that particular frequency. I do know we have an over-the-horizon, no, we have a line of sight radar in the United States, but I don't know if that's the frequency it's using.
Okay.
I think it's more like 400 megahertz.
Yes. We've got LA6UOA watching in Norway and says, I remember that sound. Now I understand why we could hear it on their record player in Norway. So that really, as you say, there were lots of other countries who must have been hearing this, including, I think you said, Saudi Arabia and areas like that. G6, Dominic, G6NQO says, remember hearing it on 10 and 11 meters as a child, hooked on listening. That doesn't fit with the frequencies that you mentioned, though. Was it the woodpecker he was hearing? That was 10 and 11 meters, he said.
Probably not.
Okay. Did they blame the effects of the radiation of the antenna on the Chernobyl power plant explosion? That's from KO4SMX.
Well, you know, I'm kind of an expert in electromagnetic interference and harm, radiation hazard. Most of the time, people have blamed very few incidents of destruction of human tissue on RF. So it's very rare that you do get biological effects. I do know that they were trying to raise the temperature of a cadaver like a certain maybe fraction of a degree centigrade, and then they multiplied that number times 10 to come up with the hazard levels. So I don't really believe that any kind of biological effects were caused by the antenna itself, but obviously the radiation from the nuclear power plant was real and highly detrimental.
Of course.
Yeah, in fact, the author of that movie, the star of the movie, had strontium in his bones, and it was causing him all kinds of ill effects. He was irradiated when he was 4 years old.
It's incredible to think actually how they covered over Chernobyl, really, with a, you know, when it was emitting all that radiation. But I guess that's a subject of another talk. I've got Rodney G0CBO says, were the Russians at the time aware of the effects of aurora, do you think?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? No. I mean, one of the questions I was going to ask you as well is, you know, the technology that you've had to hand obviously is wonderful. But in those days, we didn't have things like Google Earth to show pictures of that, and drones that can take all sorts of overhead pictures, and satellites, probably even the sort of sophisticated photography they can got now. That you've managed to reverse engineer what frequencies and bands these antennas were working on. So though you mentioned there was some quite powerful computers used there for digital processing, do we know how much the Russians knew about the propagation and the effects of their antenna? Because they didn't have such sophisticated modeling as we have now, did they?
Yeah, you're right about the fact that they didn't have as good a hold on the technology, and the computational analysis was quite stringent. But it does look like they knew the raw physics of a reflector. So like the curvature of the ionosphere, it looks like they were just using a little flat plate maybe as a mirror to find where it would bounce. And, you know, doing it brute force, you know, using a pencil and a ruler and how many bounces you're going to get, and the spreading of RF energy. So they may have been using just standard formulas to do the computations, where our computer codes now can at least get the antenna patterns brilliantly, And some codes can actually model the ionosphere much better now.
And of course, we've got much more sophisticated modelling nowadays as well, haven't we?
Right, yes.
Paul G4YQKQ says, at times I hear OHR mainly on 30 megs. I noticed the noise pattern woodpecker on my WSJT-X waterfall. I thought at times it also seems to come from South American direction, like Cuba. Any thoughts on that?
I think maybe someone else might be able to add some thoughts. Is this current, or is this during 1980s?
I think they're talking current there, Keith.
Okay, well, it should not be current that I know of, though I do know there, if it is a Russian radar, it would be coming from Moscow.
Yeah, sure. Paul MM7WAB from Ayrshire says, with 10 megawatts output, any idea what sort of current was required to drive the arrays?
Well, now you're doing vehicle IR kind of stuff. Let's see, voltage, current. It was a lot.
And they wouldn't have had the efficiency of the modern electronics either, would they?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure how much current draw. All I can tell you is that, when they used the antenna, it would have been pulling down like dimming the lights a little bit in town, so to speak.
Yes, I'm sure. LA6UAOA says, how did they tune the antenna for so many QRG?
How do they tune the antenna?
I guess so, yeah, for so many different frequencies.
Well, that's why I thought perhaps the single cage dipole had a lot of bandwidth. I think they may not have needed to retune when they switched frequencies. That's possible, but I can't be sure.
Okay. Keith G3MCD over on BATC says, I worked for Marconi with 2 megawatt radar on 600 megahertz in those days. I was told I would only have girls for children and all my kids were girls. Was there, that's what he says, was any area population study done?
Not that I know of, but it's an interesting concept.
It is, isn't it? One of the things I was going to ask you as well is what has formally, officially been acknowledged by Russia on this antenna system? Because clearly they can't pretend it doesn't exist. It's there now and it can be seen on all sorts of different media. So what is their official explanation of what this was?
I don't know if they really have an official one, to tell you the truth. The movie does show one of the people admitting that it was over the horizon radar and that it was very high power, and he has a rank in the military. So that has been admitted, at least in the movie, in an interview. So I can say that they said that they were looking for intercontinental ballistic missile launches and that they needed this to get about 25 minutes worth of reaction time. So that's about as official as I can get from these people in the movie itself who were working on the radar.
Thank you. Jeff ON8NT says, in those times, a lot of jamming stations in Russia trying blocking Radio Free Europe, VOA and the BBC. Some of these stations still exist and are hiring to broadcasters all over the world, he says.
Yes. I that does remind me that there were several coordinated efforts by radio operators to jam the Woodpecker. So they decided to, direct their energy towards that receive site and change the frequency that the Woodpecker was operating on.
Thanks. Keith, this is from Mike G4GUG. Have you done any analysis of Cobra mist system in orphardness in East England, UK, the Anglo-American version of the woodpecker?
I haven't done any of the analysis, but I do know what it looks like, and I have pictures of the antennas. They're like 4-prong antenna that is circularly polarized, I believe, but it has 2 dipoles crossed, bent downwards. That's what one element looks like, and they've got thousands of those in the array, and it is line of sight, around 400-ish megahertz.
Okay, thanks. John Rogers says, don't forget the harmonics will be very strong at these power levels, so is often seen on other frequencies as well, which I guess was you could see in the day.
He's absolutely right, and so there were just so many countries that decided to write Russia and tell them to stop, and you know, I think in the end the radar was put out of business probably by satellites rather than anything else. So the Russians went up in the air to get their missile launch information.
Well, thank you very much, Keith. We've had lots of comments as well as all the questions and specifics that I've read to you. You won't be surprised to know that lots and lots of people have said really great talk, enjoyable talk. That goes for us too. And there's lots of other information. And as you've already said, if you do want to see the whole film that was made, and maybe you should make your own judgments about how much of it was true or not, it's RussianWoodpecker.com. If you go there, you can see that trailer that you showed earlier. And also you can find out other information as well. But Keith, it's been a very enlightening talk, interesting to examine something that was quite politically, I suppose, controversial at the time, and maybe still is, looking at it from a radio amateur point of view, from a radio engineering point of view and reverse engineering. We'd like to thank you very much for the presentation tonight and for sharing it with us fellow radio amateurs. Thank you very much, Keith.
Yes, thank you very much, and I appreciate your time and the fact that we could talk about this together. It was quite a great time for me, and I enjoyed it too. So hope everybody learned something from this, and I do think we nailed it on the head in terms of some of the reverse engineering. So thank you very much.
For sure. Thank you very much, Keith. Thank you. So there we are. Thank you very much again to Keith, KI6BDR, for that wonderful presentation tonight. And before I go, I just want to give you a quick reminder that the RSGB construction competition is well underway, with the deadline for entries the 1st of March 2022. Entry is free for all RSGB members and is all online, so you don't have to send your work away to be judged. And you don't have to be an experienced constructor either, as there is a beginners category too. So why not give it a go? You can find out full details by going to this special webpage. You can see it on your screens at the bottom screens now, rsgb.org/construction-competition. And full details can also be found in Radcom. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this Tonight to Date, and that you'll be able to join us next time when Tim Kirby, GW4VXE, will be joining us live to give us a bluffer's guide to digital voice. If you'd like to see details of this and other webinars to come, or recordings of past editions, please visit rsgb.org/webinars, where you can also send us comments and feedback. And a reminder that if you subscribe to the RSGB's YouTube channel, you'll also be notified of all upcoming Tonight at 8 webinars, as well as other new videos and presentations from the Society on a wide range of amateur radio topics. But until next time, this is David G7URP signing off and clear. Bye-bye.